So we're looking at theodicy, a word you may not have come across before, and that is the vindication of divine providence in view of the existence of evil. So this is really important in terms of apologetics, because one of the very first kind of questions that most people have is, well, if God is omnipotent, why is there suffering? Why is there Now, the problem of evil is often given the form of this inconsistent triad. So J.L. Mackie made these three propositions: that first of all, that God is omnipotent, God is all powerful; second, that God is omnibenevolent, so all good; and third, that evil exists. But he argues that these propositions are inconsistent, that you can't have all three at the same time. One of them must be false. So either God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, or good and all powerful, and therefore evil does not exist, cannot exist. Second, that God is omnipotent but not omnibenevolent, so he's all powerful but not all good, thus evil exists by God's will. Or thirdly, that God is omnibenevolent but not omnipotent, so he's all good but he's not all powerful, so evil exists but it's not within God's power to stop it or to immediately impact it. Many responses have been given to the problem of evil, such as the proposition that evil exists as a consequence of a greater good. So, for example, our own free will that we've been gifted by God, or that evil is an illusion, that it doesn't really exist, it's a projection of our own selves, or that evil is even necessary for spiritual growth. And we'll be having a look at some of those propositions later on. So here we can see an image of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and it had the power of 23,000 atomic bombs and killed well over 250,000 people. So as you can see, this natural calamity and other natural world manifestations can be considered natural evil. So think about the forest fires that raged through California and Australia last year, and also about COVID-19 here and now, a virus that is causing sickness and death all around the world. And so, of course, we have the problem of moral evils. We've got natural evil that we've just discussed, which is almost random and spontaneous. And then we have moral evil, which is based on human beings' decisions and about the way people treat one another. So here we have a group of women who have recently arrived at Bergen. You can see they're still smiling. Some of them look perfectly happy. They think they're about to be showered. They're holding their belongings, and they are actually about to go through the gas chambers. Now, the Holocaust is obviously one of the obvious and most enormous moral evils, but there are many others, and they can range from, business partner taking all of the money out of a business that somebody spent a lifetime working with and leaving them destitute, right through to child abuse, and human trafficking. There's all sorts of ways in which they're moral evil, but including the kind of institutions that we might be part of. So you could talk about, the way that we run our economy, and the way that the poor and the weak and the vulnerable are marginalised. There are lots of ways in which there is moral evil in our world. And it's more about the way that people are able to tolerate doing these evil things that make them a moral evil. So you can see that God there with a group of human beings that are being treated as no more than refuse. So on this slide here, we have a really helpful chart that looks at the different aspects of the triad. So why can God not be omnipotent? Because he's seemingly incapable of preventing evil. Why is he not omnibenevolent? Well, what all-loving God would want their creatures, their creation, to suffer as they do? If God was perfectly good, he would not allow evil to happen. So what are the possible solutions? Maybe God doesn't have unlimited power. Maybe he guides rather than controls nature. Maybe his love is somehow different to our love, so it's unrealistic to expect him to intervene. Or maybe God's goodness means something different to our understanding, our human understanding of what goodness is. But there are problems with all of these solutions. if God is not in control, then it's questionable as to whether good will always overcome evil. And that is one of the basic tenets of our faith. The other problem with that is, if God is not omnipotent, omnibenevolent, is God actually ultimately God? Is he worthy of our worship? In terms of the omnibenevolence, the solutions there, the objections, they don't really give a good reason as to why God would not intervene. And so we're going to have a look at that a little bit later on. And then under the perfectly good column, if God is not really perfect, then again, is God God? And is God worthy of our worship? And so we're going to be looking at two propositions. First of all, the Augustinian proposition. And Augustine says that God created everything to be good, and that creation is good. There is no evil within God, and that all suffering, all sin is a result of the fall. Irenaeus took a slightly different perspective, and he said that moral evil was a result of God giving us free will, and that free will enabled sin and suffering to enter into our existence and into our experiences. But does that really have a strong reflection on what happens in nature, for example? We've got the book of Job, God allowing an individual to be tried or tested by Satan to see how they would stand. And then we've got this quote from John Hick from his work, Allowing for Evil. A deep and instructive principle lies in these words. They surely throw some light on that great question, the origin of evil. God has thought fit to allow evil to exist in order that he may have a platform for showing his grace, mercy, and compassion. If man had never fallen, there would have been no opportunity of showing divine mercy. But by permitting evil, mysterious as it seems, God's works of grace, mercy, and wisdom in saving sinners has been wonderfully manifested to all creatures. The redeeming of the church of elect sinners is the means of showing to principalities and powers the manifold wisdom of God. And he references Ephesians 3:10 there. Without the fall, we should have known nothing of the cross and the gospel. So let's have a closer look at Augustinian theodicy. God allows evil to exist to allow for love. And this is linked to the gift of free will. If I can't freely love you, do I love you at all? Am I merely a puppet in your hands? And God creates the world and created the world in goodness for our good. And evil is the absence or distortion of that good. Evil arose from when Adam and Eve committed the original sin. And this sin is then imputed to all humankind, all of creation, in fact. And because suffering is a punishment for sin, God ought not to intervene. So no sinning would mean no punishment. Sinning equals punishment and therefore suffering. So God, as an act of love, then offers salvation to sinners through Jesus Christ by the repentance of their sin. So that's the Augustinian theodicy in a nutshell. Feel free to rewind and just write down some notes as you run that through again. So Augustine's idea is consistent with classical theism because blame is placed entirely with humankind, and therefore God's intrinsic qualities remain completely unchallenged by the existence of evil. God is omnipotent and God is omnibenevolent. It is the gift of free will that has enabled sin and suffering to enter into our experience. However, free will is still a good thing. First of all, it enables us to love, to freely love, and to love and worship God if we so choose. But it also gives us the opportunities to do and to be good, to choose to become more like the God in whose image we are made. The weakness of Augustinian's position is that if God had created a perfect world, including perfect human beings, as he wished, they would have no trace of evil. So even while exercising free will, they would choose good. Adam and Eve would not have consciously disobeyed God's original request if they hadn't already understood something about disobedience. So this theory suggests that all world was created in a perfect form, but has been infected by sin and suffering and therefore diminishing ever since. So think about that in direct contrast to the idea that the earth and humankind and everything was formed in chaos, out of chaos, so the Big Bang. So, and out of chaos has come this orderly world that is becoming more and more orderly ever since. So you see there's two much more interesting contrasts on a more global scale there when we think about the implications of this theory. The Irenaean Theodicy comes from what could be summarised really in this passage from Hebrews 2 verse 10, and this is the Passion Translation. For now he towers above all creation, for all things exist through him and for him, and that God made him pioneer of our salvation, perfect through his sufferings. For this is how he brings many sons and daughters to share in his glory. So Jesus is the pioneer of our faith, but it's through his suffering that he brings us, God's sons and daughters, to share in his glory. And so you can see here that this is about necessary development, that the world contains evil and suffering. They give us opportunities to develop the qualities to become Christ-like or God-like, for the image of God to be revealed within us. So there's two stages of creation that are implied here. First of all, that humankind is made in the image of God, that we are intelligent but morally immature, and that human beings grow into the likeness of God, and that involves us developing our spirituality and our morality to become more Christ-like. And so now we're back to John Hick again, and this idea of soul making, that if God has made us all perfect, then we would automatically love him, but the love itself would be worthless because we would just be mere puppets. And Hick believed that humans had to endure certain hardships, difficult decisions in order for us to become better people, soul making. And we'll have a little look at the veil of soul making a little later. Hick claimed that the world could not be perfect, as this would leave no opportunity to choose good over evil, because evil would simply not be an option. So free will is absolutely essential to us growing into God's likeness, and therefore evil is a necessity to enable us to have those decisions in order to flex those morality muscles. There are also implications in terms of the natural world, because if God is to intervene to prevent suffering from sin, or even to prevent sin itself, then this could interfere with the laws of nature itself. And does God do that, or has God built laws of nature into the world and they therefore play themselves out? This is really interesting in terms of the miraculous. So in terms of the feeding of the 5,000, for example, many people have explained that miracle as a miracle of sharing, that the real miracle was that in God getting that small child to offer, assuming that the adults were all going, oh yes, I've got my picnic, and when he said, has there anybody got any food? But this child offers, then everybody else joins in, and the real miracle is the sharing, and to recognise that when we share, there is more than enough to go around. Or was it really a miracle of the food itself multiplying and there being more than enough again to go around, but it being divinely provided? Think about Peter walking on the water. So there's lots of ways in which nature is overcome in the miraculous. So not only does Theodicy look at the problem of evil and suffering, but it also helps us to think about, what do we really think is happening in the miraculous? Do we really believe in the miraculous? And what might the miraculous mean? So the strength of Irenaean Theodicy is that the world, good and evil, gives humankind the opportunity to develop godlike characteristics such as patience and compassion, and these are all essential for soul making. And as John Keats famously said, call the world, if you please, the veil of soul making, and then you will find out the use of the world. Swinburne says a world where humans can grow and develop their knowledge is far superior to one where we're just mere puppets or robots. And it may seem appealing for the cure for, I don't know, serious diseases, COVID in fact, to be prayer alone. But then this then removes the challenge and reward and perhaps even the evolution of humankind finding out the answers for themselves. It really would prevent human endeavour. The real weakness of Irenaean theodicy, however, is that suffering does not always lead people to become better people. People can become bitter, unforgiving, depressed, vengeful. We've all met people who are trauma survivors, who have PTSD, poor health, mental or physical. There's also disproportionate suffering. So think about the Holocaust. Is that justified in the process of soul making? Or what about that tsunami we saw right at the beginning of the presentation? Was it really necessary for 250,000 people to die, that others may have their souls developed through their efforts at aid and restoration? Many people develop characteristics such as compassion and patience as well without suffering, but through emulating those people who have those qualities themselves. And some violent crimes are also committed by people with significant mental health challenges. So, what are those disturbances? Can those people be held fully responsible for their choices? Are they really evil, or are they not suffering too? So, it's really difficult to justify these acts on the grounds of free will alone. And why would God design a process that would take so long, take a lifetime? Could he not speed up the process of soul making and reduce the amount of suffering that there is in the world? It also begs the question, why do some people suffer so much more than others? I've certainly met people who have endured one trauma after another throughout their life through no fault of their own, and others appear to have sailed through pretty much scot-free. And why do the innocent suffer, particularly small children, and particularly very young children? Their veil of suffering can be very short and they can die very young. What capacity do they have to learn from their experiences? And what of infant mortality? How is that made sense of in this particular theory? And so, as I said earlier, looking at Theodicy also helps us to think about the miraculous. So let's think about, for a moment, God's providence. And depending upon which wing of the church you're in, which tradition you're in, you may say it's miraculous, it's a God incident, it's serendipitous. We've all heard those phrases. So general providence is the idea that God's continuous upholding of the existence of the natural order of the universe, so maintaining life, for example, and that special providence is God's extraordinary intervention in the life of people, or what we might call a miracle. So I just want you to pause for a moment now, and in your notebooks I want you to think about maybe 2 or 3 areas of general providence that you just see in your everyday life. But I'd also like you to have a look back over your own life and think about, are there any times that you can think of, might be one, might be half a dozen, that you can think of that you would attribute to special providence, to God's extraordinary intervention in your life. And so therefore we're always asking ourselves the question, is God's intervention in the world divine providence or just providence? Is it serendipitous? Is it miraculous? And just thinking about the origins of where that word comes from, the Latin providentia, pro, ahead, and videre, to see. So it's about foresight, a sense of omnipotence again, of God being all-knowing, omniscient, a quality that God alone has, knowing what is ahead and having it in one's sights. So what do we really believe about God's providence? Do we really think that God is in complete control over all things? And this is very much about God's sovereignty. And we read a lot about this in the scriptures. So God's sovereignty over the universe, over the physical world, over the affairs of nations. There's so much written about that in the scriptures. About God's sovereignty over human destiny and even human successes and failures that, humankind can plan, but unless God is with them, will the plan come to fruition. And then, of course, there's a lot of scriptural reference to God's sovereignty in terms of the protection of God's people. But this doctrine stands in opposition to the idea that the universe is governed by chance or by fate, and that whatever happens to humankind, good or bad, there is no rhyme or reason to any of it. And so again, this is really important in terms of apologetics and talking to people about one's faith. So I now like you to have a pause for thought and ask you this question. So write it down in your notebooks and then write maybe a couple of sentences, a paragraph, and then come back to this film. My question for you is, if God is in control of all things, what meaning does any human action have? And what does that mean for us, for our status as human beings? So if God is in control of all things, what does that mean for human action and for our status as human beings? See you shortly. So back to the doctrine of divine providence. So divine providence ensures the ongoing existence of what was created, maintaining their intrinsic properties. So, for example, the properties of water, fire, the properties of air, the properties of mercury, all of these things are intrinsically them. They do not change, and God maintains them. Providence maintains the intrinsic property of all things. But also that God's providence cooperates with every created thing in every action. So therefore, we're not doing anything independently. We're doing everything cooperatively with God. There's like a co-creation there, a coexistence even. And that God is directing the distinctive properties of all things to cause them to act as they do, and ensures that their unique qualities of every created thing directs them to fulfill his purposes. So in terms of water, we could see that very clearly, that the intrinsic properties of water are maintained, and that water has a particular cycle, and that hydrates the earth and enables growth and enables life. But it's much harder to see how that process can be at work in humans and what that process might look like, because we are all so very different. There are a few scriptures you might want to have a look at if you'd like to write these down. You've got Hebrews 1 verse 3, Colossians 1 verse 17, Acts 17 verse 28. Jumping back to the Old Testament now, Nehemiah 9 verse 6, 2 Peter 3 verse 7, and then whizzing back to Job chapter 34 verses 14 to 15. So again, you might like to just pause here, read those and reflect on divine providence. So we're going to have a look at the tenets of the doctrine of divine providence, and the first tenet is preservation, that God is not continually recreating everything, God is preserving what has been created. So we're back to that order that God is maintaining, has created and is maintaining an order that is essentially itself, and that God has enabled these distinctive properties to cause them to act as they do. So this is a form of determinism, that the very nature of something determines what it will do. So you can have physical determinism, you can have psychological determinism for human beings. Whatever we've experienced will determine what we then do. And of course, the theological determinism we talked about earlier on in terms of Irenaeus and Augustine, and thinking about our sinful natures and the determinism that comes from our theological position. That God cooperates with created things in every action, that there's a concurrence. So we talked before about that coexistence, that co-creation, concurrence, that God cooperates with created things in every action, and that it is God who is directing our distinctive properties in order for us to act as we do. And so that these things bring about the results that we see. And we've got lots of scriptures here on this slide. Obviously, you can print these off, but you've got inanimate creations, so rocks. You've got animals, the way that animals behave. Although you do have the talking donkey, don't you, in Balaam, who stops a journey there. And then serendipity, which we see in Proverbs. But they're events fully caused by God and fully caused by the creatures at the same time. This concurrence, that the creatures cannot act without God. We can also see concurrence in the affairs of the nations, the way that God and leaders work together in every aspect of our lives. And sometimes some people take that right down into the minutiae of our daily lives. And it also can answer, what about evil? It answers that question, because if we look at Romans 9:17-18, for example, this is referring back to Exodus, where the Pharaoh's heart is hardened, but the hardening of the Pharaoh's heart enables God's people to be released. So it's not that the evil there is seen as a bad thing, it is actually about a process of liberating God's people. And so Pharaoh's heart was hardened concurrently with God. He acts with God even in his alleged evil. Now, I want to give you another little pause for thought, because these are phrases that trip off the tongue very easily, but I'd like to really reflect now, having listened to what we've said so far and read what we've read, to think about what you really think about these statements. So Romans 8:28 is often used when something bad happens in someone's life, and someone will come up to somebody and say, God uses all things for good. So this particular statement is claiming that God uses everything, including evil and suffering, to fulfill God's purposes, and that God is ultimately able to use evil for God's glory, and more importantly here, this phrase, and for our good. So I'd like you to think about the most heinous crime you can think of that one person could commit against another, and think about how God is ultimately able to use that evil for God's glory and for our good. The second statement that I'd like you to reflect on is God cannot be or do evil and is never to be blamed for evil. So there's no responsibility there towards God for anything that is evil. And in James chapter 1 verses 13-14 we read, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. And you can use the word tested instead of tempted there. But each person is tested or tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. So how does that work in terms of some of the suffering and evil you may have just reflected on in your first question? So again, pause the film and go back to those two questions. Does God and will God and can God ultimately use evil for God's glory and for our good? And if God cannot do or be evil, are we to be blamed entirely by our own evil desire, our own enticements, for all of the sin and suffering that we may endure? So I'm hoping now you're actually feeling a little bit confused and a little bit, well, it could be this or it could be that. It could be either or, both and. In spite of all the foregoing statements, I think we're at the point where we have to confess that we do not understand how it is that God can ordain or allow us to carry out evil deeds and yet hold us accountable for them and not be blamed God's self if God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent. So are we really free, and do we really have free will? Scripture says that we are free in the sense that we are free to choose whether to follow God or not, but so often, as we just read a moment ago in thinking about the Pharaoh, it is God who has enabled the hardening of a heart, or God who allows his people to walk away, or God who allows for something that we might think of as walking away from God or not walking in God's ways to occur, the hardening of the hearts. So are we really free? And in our freedom, we make willing choices, the freedom that we believe we have. These choices have real effects. So how do the effects of our choices impact the idea of God's providence? Yeah, so if God is divinely ordaining everything, what impact do our choices and our acts have? So another tenet of the doctrine of divine providence is government. I just want to talk to you a little bit about Calvinism, which is obviously based on the theological beliefs and teaching of John Calvin, one of the leaders of the Reformation, and Arminianism, which is based on the views of the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius, both around 1560, 1500s, to the mid 1500s and early 1600s. And this is all about God's sovereignty. So Arminianism and Calvinism are in direct opposition to one another. In Calvinism, the sovereignty of God is a belief that God is in complete control over everything. Everything that happens in the universe, his rule is supreme, his will is final. And in Calvinistic thinking, God's sovereignty is unconditional, unlimited, and absolute. So all things are predetermined. So predeterminism, predetermination, you will hear that language used, that God knew what would happen before it happened. It's God's planning, God's own will. Arminianism, on the other hand, God is sovereign, but he's limited his control in correspondence with man's freedom and response. So, in other words, God is honouring the free will that God has given us. God's decrees are associated with his foreknowledge of God's response, of man's response. So God knows how we will respond, and therefore God acts in concert concurrently with that. Now, there are distinctions concerning the will of God here. First of all, God's moral will. So that's the revealed will. So we might say, in reading through the scriptures, we would understand God's moral will. But providential government is God's secret will. So let's take, for example, Pharaoh and his heart hardening. So no doubt the people were looking at Pharaoh, seeing the hardening of his heart, and actually seeing that as a bad thing, as suffering and sinful. And yet they did not understand at that point that that was leading to their ultimate liberation. So up until now, we have been thinking a little bit on what I would call a micro scale. We've been thinking about whether God intervenes in our lives or other people's lives. We've been thinking about divine providence, whether there is the miraculous, and if so, to whom does it happen? We've been thinking about sin and suffering and the problem of evil and where that arises. But it's been very personalised. So we're going to look now about the decrees of God, and this is about the eternal plans of God, and this is much more thinking on a macro scale. Yeah, so all of those things still stand, so I want you to keep those in the back of your mind, but where do they fit in this big picture? So we're going to look at Calvinism and Arminianism again, as we look at the eternal plans of God, so the decrees of God. So Calvinists believe that humankind, because of the fall, are essentially dead in their sin, unable to save themselves, and that God initiates salvation. And Arminianism, on the other hand, believes that because of the fall, humankind now has a corrupted nature, but that through prevenient grace, so that is God going before, the Holy Spirit going before, God has removed the guilt of Adam's sin. So prevenient grace is the kind of preparatory work of the Holy Spirit, that we're not entirely depraved. We still hold something of the image of God. And it is this prevenient grace that enables us then to respond to God's call. Because if we were completely depraved, we would be unable to. Now, the difficulty for us is that irrespective of our perspective on Calvinism or Arminianism, we are still responsible for our actions, and the scriptures make this very clear, that our actions have real results and they do change the course of events. And if our actions didn't, then we wouldn't have all of the pastoral letters talking about the gifts of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit, and asking us to become Christ-like. Now, prayer is one of the kinds of actions that we can take and that can have um, active results that change the course of events. We've got examples in scripture there, but I'd like you now again to pause this video and to think about maybe 2 times when you prayed and you felt your prayer was unheard or unanswered, and 2 times when you prayed and you felt that your prayer was answered. And then have a look and see if there are any differences between them, or whether they're all pretty much the same and actually it just seems to be random which prayers are answered and which are not. And also think about how they were answered and why they were answered in the way that they were, if you are able to. But one thing that is certain, prayer aside, is that we must act and take responsibility. We cannot just be passive and say, well, it's all in God's hands, it's all in control. God's predetermined everything anyway, so there's no point trying. Actually, we are called to co-create. We are called to be working with God in partnership. Now, again, I want you to go back to your notebooks with this next question. And to have this discussion with yourself in your own head, because I'm hoping by now you will have some quite conflicting and contrasting ideas about what it is that you already believe and what it is that you are hearing today. So in order to preserve actual human freedoms and a genuine freedom of choice for human personhood, and remember that this is all about us growing into God's likeness, God cannot cause or plan our voluntary choices. So if God cannot cause or plan our voluntary choices, how does God hold onto God's sovereignty? And where does this Armenian position, where does this position of freedom and liberation stand with the overarching picture of God's salvation? So if you and I have absolute freedom of choice, and that the calling is for us to grow into God's likeness, but God cannot affect our choices in any way, what does this say to us about our ideas of God's providence in our lives? Now, I want to ask a series of questions over the next few slides, which we are ending with, but these are really big questions. So I'd like you to note them in your notebooks and maybe use the pastoral reflective cycle to reflect on how some of these impact your thinking or impact the way that you live out your Christian discipleship and ministry. So the Armenian position would say that any of the verses that are examples of God's providential control, so God being miraculous, God intervening, that these are exceptions and that they're not how God ordinarily works within human activity, but are the exceptions a rule, if that makes sense. The Armenian position would also say that the Calvinist view wrongly makes God responsible for sin. So if God has predetermined everything, then God has also predetermined those acts that are sinful and that create suffering. And the Armenian position would also say that any choices caused by God are not real choices. So therefore, if God is hardening our hearts against something, or God is blinding us to something, then therefore it's not our responsibility if we are then blind, deaf and dumb to something. So the Armenian view is claiming to encourage responsible Christian living, where we take responsibility for our actions, that we choose to become more Christ-like, and we choose to mature and enable the image of God to be seen within ourselves. But they'd also claim that the Calvinistic view encourages a dangerous fatalism, that it's all predestined, it's all predetermined, there's not a fat lot we can do about this. So what are your responses to these positions? And do you think that scriptures, yes, we have the scriptures, but the scriptures only actually collate together the extraordinary and unusual examples of God, not the way that God works ordinarily? Do you think the Calvinistic doctrine of God's providence makes God responsible for sin? What are your thoughts on that? So these are massive questions, and I'm not going to give you any answers. I'm not going to tell you what I think about them, but I want you to think about them, because these are the sorts of questions that people will ask you. And as teachers and preachers of the faith, you need to be ready with an answer, or at least ready to say, well, I'm not sure, but, and be able to bat some of these ideas around with them. I also want you to think about God's grace as well. God's grace has to do with God's call to salvation. So Calvinism, through that predestination, predeterminism, is saying that God's grace is irresistible. So if you are exposed to God's grace, you cannot refuse it. While Arminianism would say that you can resist it, that you have free choice, and if you want to walk away from God, that you can. And so Calvinists would say that while God extends his common grace to all humankind, it is not sufficient to save anyone. Only God's irresistible grace will draw the elect to salvation and make a person willing to respond. So again, think about that word, the elect. That in Calvinism, there are a group of people that God has elected to be saved. And that grace, it can't be obstructed, it can't be resisted, it can't be walked away from. But what does that also say about God's relationship with those who are unelected? And that's certainly a question worth reflecting on. Arminianism, on the other hand, would say that the prevenient grace that we talked about beforehand, the Holy Spirit within us responding, we're all able, all humankind is able to respond to God with faith and come to salvation. And that this prevenient grace has removed the effect of Adam's sin to the point that we are able to then choose between good or evil, God, not God, that we have a really self-directed sense of free will that God does not intervene in. So now we've come to the end of our lecture. I put those questions on these last two slides so that you don't have to write them down. I want you to have a look at these scriptures here, Hebrews, Colossians and Ephesians. And I want you to think very much about what is the usual ordinary way in which God's providence, the miraculous and evil and suffering exist and coexist. Because it's very easy to discover that you have one theory about one aspect and that you actually have an opposing theory about another. So if you find that you have one theory about sin and suffering, but that's actually in contrast to your theories around salvation, then have a little look at that and see where that dissonance is, and see whether there's a way in which, using the pastoral reflective cycle, you can become a bit more consonant. You can have one overarching theological perspective on sin, suffering and providence. Absolutely lots to take in. I hope you really enjoy going back over them. And then, of course, go on to have a look about whether Calvin's doctrine of God's providence really does make God responsible for sin. What are your views on that? And whether our choices ordained by God really are real choices. And have a real look at whether you've got one particular theological perspective on providence, perhaps, and another one on sin and suffering, or whether you have one on the problem of evil and a completely different one, an opposing view, Calvinistic view maybe, on salvation, and see if, using the pastoral reflective cycle, whether you can't come to one theological perspective that covers sin and suffering, providence, and the miraculous. And finally, this question: can choices ordained by God be real choices? Did God really want me to be the director of lay training? Did I really say yes on that interview? Are you being called to be licensed lay ministers? Can you resist that call? Could you have said yes or no? There's something for you to reflect on. I hope you've enjoyed this. As I say, there's lots to be going on with. There's a bibliography for you to have a look at, and I hope you really enjoy continuing to explore the doctrine of our faith.